Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to forecasts or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we have out for the state. You can also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. Starting off, we'll take a look at some of the warnings and advisories that we do have out for the state. Starting off on the west coast and southwest Alaska down into the Alaska Peninsula, we do have wind chill advisories in effect for all of those locations. And those are going to be expiring early on Thursday, some of them going as late as noon on Thursday. As we move a little bit to the east and to the eastern part of the Kenai Peninsula, we do have a blizzard warning that is in effect until 4 a.m. on Thursday morning. And that is primarily for the road system there, for the Whittier area, through Portage and through Turnagain Pass as well. As we move out further to the east and the Panhandle area, we do have several warnings out. They're kind of split between ones that are in the north and then ones that are in the south. The northern ones are winter storm warnings, and those are going to start off as snow and then transition over to high winds as we move into Thursday. And those are going to be in effect through much of Thursday evening for these ones further to the north. And then as we get to the more southern locations, those are all going to be high wind warnings, and those are going to be in effect tonight into Thursday afternoon time frame. Again, check your local forecast to get the exact timing and impacts for hazards for your locations. As we now move up further to the north, we have some more wind chill advisories stretching through much of the Brooks Range down into parts of the interior and up through that northeastern part of the Brooks Range. That's a wind chill warning as opposed to the wind chill advisories, with wind chills getting as low as 70 below zero up in that northeastern part of the Brooks Range. And these are going to be until times into Friday for some of these more northern locations. However, in the more southern reaches, we're going to get into some of those Thursday time frames. So again, check the local websites for information for exact timing for your location. We have more wind chill advisories along the coast that are going to be for much of the Seward Peninsula, Kotzebue Sound area, that southwestern portion of the Brooks Range, including Ambler. And again, those are going to be extending. The more southern ones are going to expire earlier on Thursday, and as we get further to the north, expiring later and later, with some of those getting into the Friday evening time frame. Taking a look now at what's causing some of this, we do have a low pressure system starting to form in the northern part of the Bering Sea, bringing in some precipitation out to the western locations. And then we do have some high pressure dominating. You can see some of the darker cloud cover indicating that it's a little bit lower in the sky, some of that stratus and some of the Aleutians into the central Aleutians as well. Moving out over the mainland part of the state, not a lot of activity for the northwestern part, but we do have that strong northerly wind that's coming down the coastline, bringing in some blowing snow conditions for areas out over the Bering Strait. And then as we look back over the Gulf of Alaska, we have one low that's out by the Kenai Peninsula with another low that is pushed inland, bringing in a lot of precipitation to the southeast and North Gulf Coast areas. Taking a look for the remainder of today, we do have that southerly flow bringing in some warmer air, transitioning some of those or southern portions of the Panhandle over to rain, but those northern locations starting off as snow, especially as we get to the northern part and higher elevations of the Panhandle. Our low pressure system out over the Kenai Peninsula, again bringing those blizzard conditions to the eastern part of the Kenai Peninsula, and some snow all along the North Gulf Coast into much of south central Alaska. Some of that snow extending up into the central part of the interior and out over the northeastern parts of the state. Some fog lingering up along the North Slope area, and then as we move over the west coast of the state, we will have some blowing snow from the Point Hope area down through the Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island into those western portions of the Norton Sound area, but not a lot of new snowfall, just stronger winds picking up some of the snow that's already fallen over the area. And then as we move down into the southwest part of the state, we will have some snows get closer to the Alaska Peninsula and throughout the Aleutian Islands. Low pressure coming in from the west, bringing some more precipitation to the northern parts of the Bering Sea. For tonight, that low is going to continue to slowly move east, bringing in more snow to the northern parts of the Bering, through the central Bering, out through all of the Aleutian Islands and the Alaska Peninsula. That northerly flow is going to keep most of that snow on the Bering side of the islands and peninsula. Up along the west coast, not a lot of precipitation, but we will have with some stronger winds bringing in some blowing snow conditions to those same locations of St. Lawrence Island through the Bering Strait and up by Point Hope. some lingering areas of fog for western portions of the North Slope. And as we move into the interior part of the state and Brooks Range, we will have snow pressing through all of the interior down into south central Alaska. Another low forming off of the old one that's by Kodiak Island, bringing in reinforcement of snow all along the North Gulf Coast and south central Alaska. And then a new system coming up from the south, bringing in some stronger winds as we saw earlier. And then we are going to see some areas of snow starting off to those areas further to the north. As we move into Thursday, that low is going to push off into Canada, and we are going to have some warmer air following behind, transitioning a lot of our snow to a mix of rain and snow. Snow along the North Gulf Coast and into western portions of the interior up along the Arctic coastline as well, with some blowing snow lingering over the Seward Peninsula area, and then snow for the Alaska Peninsula out into the Aleutian Islands. Then on Friday, we are going to see a new system coming up, bringing snow and rain to the western Aleutians. Snow throughout much of the remainder of the Aleutian Islands up by the Pribilofs as well. Then out over the interior part of the state, we will have snow up along the Arctic coastline, into the interior, along the North Gulf Coast, into southeast Alaska. For our lows, dropping down above freezing for the Panhandle area, into the teens for much of south central Alaska. Below zero for the interior, with the coldest temperatures along the Arctic coastline Thursday morning. Down along the west coast of the state into the minus teens, and then into the 20s for much of the Aleutians, around freezing out west. For Thursday afternoon, getting up into the mid-30s and into the 20s for the Alaska Peninsula, staying below zero all along the interior west coast of the state and Arctic coastline, into the teens for south central Alaska and into the 30s for southeast. Friday morning, right about freezing for the Panhandle area, single digits for south central, well below zero for all locations of the interior west coast and Arctic coastline, and then down in the Aleutian Islands, right about freezing for those morning lows Friday morning. For highs, getting into the 30s for much of the Aleutian Islands, staying well below zero in the negative teens for all the interior west coast of the state, around minus 30 along the Arctic coastline, and then it's getting into the teens for much of the south central area, around freezing right along the North Gulf Coast, and then into the mid-30s for much of southeast Alaska.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with our flying weather. Thursday morning out over the Bering Sea. Southern parts, western parts of the Bering Sea, all in MVFR conditions with some isolated areas of IFR in the central part of the Bering. As we move over mainland Alaska, we do have an area of IFR conditions extending up from Kodiak Island into the interior part of the state and then up into the Brooks Range and eastern parts of the Arctic coastline. Moving out to the east, we have MVFR conditions out over the Gulf of Alaska, much of south central Alaska as well, with some IFR for Prince William Sound, and then some MVFR and IFR conditions throughout much of the Panhandle. As we move into Thursday afternoon, some of those IFR conditions clearing up in much of the Panhandle with the exception of areas to the south. MVFR conditions remaining for much of the Gulf of Alaska and into much of south central as well. IFR conditions still extending up from the Bristol Bay area through east or western parts of the interior up into much of the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline. Along the west coast of the state, however, going to remain VFR for Thursday afternoon, and then MVFR conditions through much of the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Alaska Peninsula. As we move into Friday morning, we do have some isolated areas of IFR in the central and western parts of the Bering Sea, and then some MVFR and IFR through the Aleutian Islands, and then MVFR into the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island. In that western part of the interior, extending down towards the Bristol Bay area, we do have some IFR conditions continuing up into the Brooks Range as well, and then eastern parts of the Arctic coastline. Down in south central Alaska, primarily MVFR conditions, especially as we get closer towards the Gulf of Alaska, with some areas from the eastern parts of Prince William Sound out into the Yakutat area, some IFR conditions there, and then MVFR with isolated areas of IFR in the Panhandle. Friday afternoon, MVFR conditions lingering throughout the Panhandle area along the North Gulf Coast as well, with some areas of IFR by the Cordova area out towards Yakutat, and then in western parts of the interior we are going to continue to see IFR conditions extending up to the central and western parts of the Brooks Range and then along some of the Arctic coastline as well. Down into the Bering Sea, we do have MVFR and IFR conditions expected through Friday afternoon, and that's going to be true in the Aleutian Islands as well, starting to clear up a little bit as we get into the Alaska Peninsula. As we look into our passes starting up north, AKwx Pass, IFR conditions are expected for Thursday, as well as Adigan Pass. Dropping down to the Alaska Range, we do have Lake Clark and Merrill both going to be marginal throughout the day on Thursday. That's going to be true of Rainy Pass as well. And then Windy Pass will start off marginal, improve to VFR conditions later in the afternoon on Thursday. Isabel Pass will be the same, starting off in VFR, improving to VFR. And Mentasta will stay VFR throughout the day. As we drop down towards the Anchorage area, we are going to get Tenita Pass at marginal conditions as well as Portage at marginal conditions. And then out over in the southeastern part of the state, Chilkoot and White are both going to start off IFR and then improve to marginal conditions later in the afternoon. For our freezing levels for Thursday, we do have an area of warmer air extending into the southern portions of the Panhandle with our surface freezing line up to northern portions of the Panhandle riding along the North Gulf Coast before dipping into the Central Gulf and coming back over our area by the eastern Aleutian Islands and then going into the central and western parts of the Bering Sea. Taking us to our icing, starting off to the west out over the central and western Aleutian Islands between 3,000 and 8,000 feet expected. Moving over southwestern part of the state between 5,000 and 10,000 feet expected, extending out over towards Kodiak Island as well. And then for all of southeast Alaska, about 4,000 feet is expected there on Thursday. For our jet, we have one branch of the jet over southeast portions of the state out of a southwesterly direction, 130 knots there. And as we move over to the western Aleutian Islands, a westerly component of the jet around 95 knots is expected on Thursday. Dropping down to 9,000 feet, we have westerly flow 25 to 40 knots, strongest as we get closer towards the Aleutian Islands, becoming northerly along the west coast of the state, getting as high as 40-45 knots through much of the southwestern portion of the state into the Alaska Peninsula. And then with our low pressure out over mainland Alaska, we do have southerly flow over eastern portions of the state with the highest 55 up to as high as 70 as we get closer towards the Panhandle. Down to 3,000 feet southwesterly flow, continuing for the Panhandle area, 35 knots over southeast, dropping off as we get out over Canada. Northeasterly flow out over the mainland part of the state, 10 to 40 knots with the highest as we get closer towards the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline. Northerly flow along the west coast of the state, around 45 knots, dropping off as we move out over the Bering Sea, 15 to 25 knots there. And then a westerly flow out over the Aleutian Islands, around 30 knots. For our turbulence below 3,000 feet for the central Aleutians, then along the west coast of the state below 4,000 feet all the way up the coastline down through the Alaska Peninsula, and below 5,000 feet is expected for all the areas of the Panhandle with the exception of the Yakutat area. And if you hang on, we'll be back shortly with the marine forecast.
Some places on the surface you might have these steep cracks and giant fissures that you would have to be careful not to fall into. In other places you might see towers of ice right next to places that were relatively smooth. You might see places that were dark. Ice there takes the form of rock. It's frozen solid until you dig down into that ocean. So you may see some things that look similar to Earth, but you may see some things that are very different.
That voice you just heard?
I am Morgan Kramer, NASA scientist.
I love it.
That's Morgan. She's probably one of NASA's best spokespeople for exploring our solar system's icy moons.
Europa is a fascinating place. It has this liquid water ocean that's about 3 times the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined. That's a lot of water.
To understand what makes Earth so special, sometimes you need to back up and take in the big picture. Remember, the cryosphere is every place on Earth with frozen water. And water is one of the biggest indicators for life.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it.
And so far, Earth is the only planet we know of with life. Although Europa isn't the only icy moon in our solar system, NASA has identified it as one of those places with key astrobiological potential. Morgan is a collaborator on the Mapping Imaging Spectrometer for Europa, an instrument selected for NASA's next mission to Jupiter's icy moon Europa. But she's also more than just a scientist working in a laboratory. She's preparing future NASA missions for success on the surface of alien worlds. This year, Morgan and her colleagues were in the field studying how life colonizes in fresh lava.
Earth, it turns out, has a lot of excellent, what we call analog environments, places that are similar enough to some of these other worlds that we can conduct some tests and we can do some analyses here. Now, they're not perfect, of course. They're not going to be exactly like Europa, but we can still learn a lot by testing in these environments. Some of these places include Antarctica and the Arctic Circle, but there are other places too, Alaska, Greenland, even Iceland. Any place where you have a lot of ice, because guess what the surface of Europa is made of? A lot of ice.
Studying the cryosphere doesn't just have big implications for Earth. It also matters for the frozen worlds in our own cosmic backyard.
If we're able to find life or evidence of past life on a place like Europa, that tells us that not only can life happen in other places, but it's common enough that it happened at least twice in the same tiny solar system. That means that the universe is wide open in terms of how much life we might find, the types of life we might find. It would revolutionize how we see ourselves and the possibilities for contact in the universe. It would be amazing. Oh, it's so exciting.
As it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. So it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving. My interest in glaciers comes from the sheer size of these things and how much they're able to change on human timescales. And so the amount of mass and energy being transferred by glaciers around the globe is tremendous. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to study from space.
Mountain glaciers are some of the most charismatic parts of the cryosphere. Some might cling to the edges of cliffs at higher elevations, then lay bare and flat in a broad plain, looking cracked and weathered like elephant skin, before tumbling thousands of feet toward the sea and terminating in a dramatic calving front. They're like motion frozen in time, until they aren't. They tell a story about the distant past and yet are incredibly responsive to the present. You can understand why they'd be captivating to all of us, and especially cryospheric scientists. Meet Alex Gardner, a cryospheric scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who is going to help break down what a classic West Coast North American glacier might look like, where high amounts of snow dump onto the mountains.
And at higher elevations, there's melt in summer, but not enough melt to get rid of all of that snow. And so that snow accumulates, it compacts, it turns into ice, and it starts to flow under its own weight, and it flows down the valleys. And as it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out and down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving.
Alex uses satellite data to study large-scale changes in glacial ice. But 2,000 miles to the north, Chris Larson from the University of Alaska Fairbanks spends a lot of time studying glaciers from the air. He's been flying over Alaskan mountain glaciers for many years, most recently on a NASA-funded mission called Operation Icebridge Alaska. He's absolutely enamored with his local rivers of ice.
And what do you love about mountain glaciers?
Well, they're in mountains, so they're really pretty. You couldn't ask for a better way to experience Alaska on a large scale than to go flying around for campaign after campaign and look at all of the mountains in Alaska. Truly infinite. You just feel like you'll never see the end of them and don't want to either.
But Chris doesn't spend weeks away from home and family for the views. Chris and his colleagues at NASA want to answer some pretty big questions by learning more about Alaskan glaciers and how they tick.
You know, why does NASA care about these? Well, they actually disproportionately contribute a large amount to sea level rise.
In the long run, as the Earth warms due to climate change, the big ice sheets and mighty outlet glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica stand to contribute the most to sea level rise, simply because the vast majority of the planet's ice is stored there. But currently, it's the world's smaller mountain glaciers in comparatively warmer places like Alaska and Patagonia that are contributing about a third of all inputs to sea level rise, even though they account for only 1% of the world's ice.
Mostly due to them being dynamic. They have water at the bed, which allows them to slide fast, and they react quickly to climate change and have higher velocities than their polar counterparts.
Back at JPL, AKwx uses satellite measurements of global ice and computer models to predict ultimately how much sea level rise we might see due to climate change. But in the case of mountain glaciers, we also care about the local impacts of disappearing ice.
When we think of changes in ice sheets, we typically think of just what is the consequence for sea level rise and the future evolution of the ice sheets. But glaciers in other regions, like high mountain Asia, Alaska, the European Alps, these are places where changes in runoff matters to stream flows. In places like high mountain Asia, you have a lot of glaciers that feed the streams that flow down to populated regions. And that runoff becomes significant for water resources, irrigation, and agriculture.
Both AKwx and Chris are passionate about understanding how glaciers are changing and what it means for our planet's future. They'll continue to use tools like elevation maps from the ICESat-2 satellite and detailed airborne measurements to monitor changing ice.
By the end of the tunnel, you're about 100 feet underground, and you're surrounded by bones sticking out of the wall from the steppe bison and the mastodons. There's sticks that are 40,000 years old. There's grass that's still green, that's tens of thousands of years old.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine portion of the forecast. We'll start off with a quick look at the ice edge. We do have the ice edge pushing down through St. Matthew Island, still north of the Pribilof Islands, down into Bristol Bay. However, we are expecting on Friday and Saturday with a system coming up from the south that'll bring some warmer air to push the strands of ice out in front back into the main ice pack, and then it will recover back on Sunday and start to push further to the south again with some northerly flow returning. Out over the Cook Inlet area down by Kamishak Bay, we do have ice in those areas as well. And some of that Kamishak Bay ice is moving south into the northern portions of Shelikof Strait. So keep that in mind if you're traveling through that area. Taking a look now at the main part of the marine forecast, pretty windy over southeast Alaska. We do have winds out of a westerly direction, primarily becoming southerly as we get closer towards the Craig area, with winds as high as 55 to 65 knots out of that southerly direction. But also further to the north, we have some gusts up to as high as 75 knots out of that westerly direction. In the inside, water's pretty strong there as well. Southerly flow increasing from 35 knots up north up to as high as 55 knots further to the south, with gusts as high as 70 knots. Seas in the inside waters at 21 feet, diminishing as we get further to the north, but still fairly high up by the Lynn Canal area at 7 feet on Thursday. Winds dying down quite a bit on Friday for southeast Alaska, still out of a southerly direction in the inside waters, 22-25 knots as we get further to the north. Out in the Gulf, we do have southwesterly flow primarily, 20 knots there, seas as high as 16 feet. As we move out over south central Alaska on Thursday in Cook Inlet, out of a northerly direction, 10 to 15 knots. A lot stronger out of Kamishak Bay, 50 knots there, with seas as high as 16 feet, dropping down to 40 knots on the eastern side of the Barren Islands. Out over the Gulf, we do have winds primarily out of a southerly direction, around 20 knots, and becoming east 20 in Prince William Sound. Then on Friday, flow in Prince William Sound northerly 15 knots, southerly in the northern part of the Gulf, around 20 knots there. And then northwesterly flows as we get closer towards the Barren Islands, picking up to 45 to 50 knots around the Barren Islands. Cook Inlet diminishing to 25 knots in the southern portions and down to 10 further to the north. For the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island area is northwesterly flow around the peninsula, 25 to 30 on the Bering side, 40 knots on the Pacific side, and then 40 knots out of a westerly direction around Kodiak Island. Seas as high as 11 feet to the east of Kodiak Island. Then on Friday, northwesterly flow, 35 knots all around Kodiak Island, with seas getting up to as high as 13 feet. And then on the Bering side of the Alaska Peninsula, northerly flow, 25 knots there. Out over the Aleutian Islands, westerly flow for much of the central and western Aleutian Islands, around 25 knots. Becoming a little bit more northwesterly as we get by the eastern Aleutians, up to as high as 35 knots on the Pacific side, with seas around 12 to 13 feet around the eastern Aleutian Islands. Then on Friday, flow switching up a fair amount, becoming more westerly for much of the eastern Aleutian Islands, 20 to 25 knots, and southeasterly ahead of a frontal system moving through the area. That's around 20 knots there. Then out over the central Aleutian Islands, we do have a southwesterly flow 20 to 25 knots, and then easterly flow 25 knots out by the western Aleutians. Along the west coast of the state, northerly flow for the most part 15 to 25 knots, increasing to 30 knots on the southern side of Nunavik Island, and then out by St. Matthew Island, easterly flow 15 knots there. Then on Friday, primarily northerly flow for the most part, 10 to 15 knots north of Nunavik Island, increasing to 25 knots south of the island, southeast 25 by the Pribilof Islands, and St. Matthew Island the strongest, southeasterly flow 30 knots there. Thursday, along the Arctic coastline, northeasterly flow along the coast 15 knots, getting stronger and out of a northerly direction as we get by the Kotzebue Sound area, 25 knots there through the Strait, 25 as well. Then on Friday, dropping down to 20 knots around the Bering Strait area, and then 10 knots all along the Arctic coastline out of a north to northeasterly direction. Recap of weather for tonight. We do have a low pressure system out of the northwestern portions of the Bering Sea bringing snow to the Bering down into the Aleutian Islands as well. Northerly flow bringing snow to the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutian Islands, with the majority of the snow on the Bering side on that northerly flow component. Up by the St. Lawrence Island area through the Bering Strait and up by Point Hope, we have some blowing snow conditions, just resuspending some of the snow that is already on the ground. And then along the Arctic coastline for tonight, we do have some fog in western portions with snow further off to the east. That snow extending down through much of the interior part of the state. And all through the west coast, we do have some wind chill advisories in effect that are going to last through much of Thursday. And then we do have some wind chills for the northern parts of the interior into the Brooks Range with a wind chill warning up in the northeastern part of the Brooks Range with wind chills getting down to as low as minus 70. Blizzard warning in effect for the eastern part of the Kenai Peninsula as we have this system moving through the area, bringing snow and winds to areas through Whittier, Portage Valley, and through the Turnagain Pass area. And we also have some winter storm warnings and high wind warnings for southeast Alaska. Check your listings for exact timing and impacts for those locations.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.